So in today's lecture, we are going to talk about the lymphatic system. And the lymphatic system is closely associated with the cardiovascular system because the lymphatic system is going to help recycle fluids lost in the cardiovascular system. Some of the functions of the lymphatic system are defense, which we'll discuss in another lecture, or what we call immunity. Then there's fat absorption. And the last one is fluid balance, which is what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. So as we mentioned before, the lymphatic system is going to help regulate or recycle fluids lost by the cardiovascular system. So underneath fluid balance, we'll just write recycle fluids lost by the cardiovascular system. Before we talk about how the lymphatic system recycles lymph, we're going to talk about the pathway that this fluid takes in order to get back to the cardiovascular system. So we're going to look at the pathway of flow of lymph. Okay. So the first thing that has to happen is lymph has to enter the tiniest structures of the lymphatic system called lymphatic capillaries. And lymphatic capillaries are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. In other words, their walls are a single layer thick. Right? And the reason why that the walls of the lymphatic capillaries have to be simple squamous epithelial tissue is for diffusion. Right? So things can easily diffuse across the walls of the lymphatic capillaries. Now, emerging lymphatic capillaries form larger structures, right, called lymphatic vessels. And within lymphatic vessels, right, you'll find valves. And these valves have a similar function to the valves of veins in the cardiovascular system. These valves in lymphatic vessels prevent lymph from flowing backwards. Along the pathway of lymphatic vessels, you'll also find structures called lymph nodes. Right? And lymph nodes are packed with lymphocytes. Right? And the function of a lymph node is to help cleanse the lymph. Right? So now emerging lymphatic vessels form larger structures called lymphatic ducts. Right? And lymphatic ducts will dump their lymph into the cardiovascular system through vessels called veins. Again, veins will dump the fluid back into the cardiovascular system. So now let's take a look at a picture that illustrates the pathway of lymph through the lymphatic system. So the first thing I want to point out to you is how closely associated the lymphatic system is with the cardiovascular system. So here you have the cardiovascular system. So this here structure, hopefully you remember from the last chapter, that's the heart. Right? And then you have blood vessels leaving the heart. Right? Blood vessels that carry blood away from the heart are called arteries. Blood vessels that carry blood to the heart are called veins. And then in between arteries and veins, right, we have smaller blood vessels called capillaries. Right? And these capillaries, remember, are made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue so that fluids and gases can easily diffuse between capillaries into the tissues. Okay. So these green arrows up at the top, right, represent the movement of fluid from the cardiovascular system to the lymphatic system. So once this fluid enters the lymphatic system, that fluid is now called lymph. And that lymph is picked up by these structures here called lymphatic capillaries. And merging lymphatic capillaries form larger structures called lymphatic vessels. And along the pathway of lymphatic vessels, you have structures that clean the lymph called lymph nodes. And then merging lymphatic vessels form larger vessels called lymphatic ducts. And lymphatic ducts return lymph or recycles lymph back to the cardiovascular system through veins. So our next topic for discussion is, how is lymph produced? So how is this lymph produced? Fluid comes in all different forms, especially in different systems. So here I've drawn a capillary. Right. So you now know that a capillary, we'll call this a blood capillary. So a blood capillary is part of the cardiovascular system. And within this blood capillary, right, you're going to find red blood cells. Right. And you're also going to find the fluid within this blood capillary called plasma. Now remember that a blood capillary is also made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. So the wall of a blood capillary is very thin, and this is to allow for diffusion. Right? Specifically, we're going to talk about diffusion of particles that you find within the plasma. You also have to remember that diffusion of gases is going to occur across a blood capillary. Okay? So within this plasma, right, you have antibodies, you have nutrients, but also within this plasma you might be able to find things we don't want, like pathogens. Okay. Right, so that's all found within this fluid. Now blood capillaries are found next to tissues. Right? And recall that a tissue, by definition, is a group of cells that perform a common function. So here I'm drawing 3 tissue cells. Right? And here's their nuclei. Right. So in order for these cells, right, to function, they need the nutrients from the plasma, right, from the blood capillaries. Right. So by diffusion, plasma diffuses into the cell, delivering whatever plasma is carrying. Now this fluid no longer is called plasma when it's in tissue cell. We call it tissue fluid. So now that these cells have their nutrients, what do you do with the fluid? Well, that fluid has to be returned back to the cardiovascular system. Well, how do you do that? Well, we introduce the lymphatic system. So what you're looking at here is a lymphatic capillary. A lymphatic capillary is a closed-end vessel. In other words, it's not open to anything else, right? It's only open in one direction. So we call it a closed vessel, or closed-ended. Okay, closed-ended. So now this tissue fluid that's in the cells moves into lymphatic capillaries. Well, this fluid from tissues is no longer called tissue fluid. This fluid is now called lymph. And then this lymph will travel to larger merging structures called lymphatic vessels back to ducts, and then ducts will return lymph back to the cardiovascular system through veins once that lymph has been cleaned, which we talked about in the previous lecture. Okay? So this is how lymph is produced. The final discussion of the lymphatic system will be about lymphatic organs. And lymphatic organs are either going to be involved with immunity or they're going to be involved with recycling of lymph. So the first lymphatic organ that I want to point out is the lymphatic organ that sits right above the heart. So here's the heart, here's the lymphatic organ that sits right above the heart. This is called the thymus gland. And the thymus gland is the location where T lymphocytes, right, commonly known as or referred to as T cells, mature. Then you have found in bones, right? Found in bones. Right, so here's a bone right here, right? They're showing you a humerus. And found within a bone is something called red bone marrow. Now, red bone marrow contains things called stem cells. And stem cells are cool little cells because stem cells can be programmed to become any type of cell in the body. In this case, stem cells found in bone marrow, right, will mature and become things called B lymphocytes, or B cells. The next organ is right here, right, found just below your chest, underneath your lungs, right next to your stomach. This is called the spleen, right? And the spleen acts as a reservoir for blood. It also helps remove old red blood cells, right? So it removes them out of circulation. Right? And then up in the nasal cavity and in the oral cavity, right, you have these tiny little structures here, right? These are called tonsils, right? So tonsils, the reason why you have tonsils located in the nasal and oral cavities is because they're exposed to the external environment. So as you breathe in air, your air has to be filtered through the nose by mucous membranes and hair, but it also gets filtered by these tonsils. Just like in the mouth, you have tonsils that filter the food that you eat, or help filter the food that you eat. The last lymphatic organ that I'm going to discuss are these tiny circular structures that are found along the lengths of lymphatic vessels. These tiny circular structures are what we call lymph nodes. And as I mentioned to you before, lymph nodes help cleanse lymph. So we're going to take a closer look at a lymph node. So here's a lymph node. And what this lymph node has is kind of this labyrinth or a maze within it. And this labyrinth or maze is filled with structures called lymph nodules. And lymph nodules are just clusters of lymphatic tissue. And within this lymphatic tissue is where you find lymphocytes. So as lymph circulates through these lymph nodules, these lymphocytes, T cells and B cells, they clean that lymph as it passes through.